I'm pleased to welcome back my guest today. I believe this is his fourth appearance on the podcast. He was the CAO for the Regional Waterloo from 2004 until his retirement in 2020. We have been having ongoing discussions on the history of the ION and Waterloo region, and today we will conclude our discussion focusing on the construction of the ION. So without further introduction, I welcome back to the Old Grey Mares podcast, Mike Murray. Mike, welcome back.
Well, yeah, thanks, Rob. It's nice to be back. Yeah, always good to get invited back, and hopefully we're able to, conclude
Yes.
the ION saga. Eh?
Well, I want to get wrapped up because I'm telling everyone this is the ION trilogy, and it's just like the Gordon Lightfoot Canadian Railroad trilogy. So this will forever be known as the Mike Murray Waterloo Region ION trilogy.
All right, love it.
So, Mike, where we left off last time, we were it was August 2014, and I believe that was the shovel ceremony. What do you call that?
Groundbreaking.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. We dig the shovels in the ground and everyone tosses the dirt in the air and the politicians all leave because, hey, we're done. And yada, yada, yada. We're cutting the ribbon in 2019. So we had the groundbreaking at that point. We had the consortium selected, Grand League. They already started work at that point as well, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Now, I just want to correct one thing because we had this discussion last time. Grand Link Consortium had been selected to do the construction. And I believe the trains have been ordered at that point too.
The trains had been ordered, and that's that's a bit of the saga we can get into today, I'm sure.
Yeah, we will. So the first podcast, we talked about the history and it took us to January 1, 2011. And then the second podcast, we got into that, the whole deal post 2010 election and that sort of 6-month window to June. And then where Grand Links was selected. I think the ION name was picked by that point too. And then we have the groundbreaking ceremony. And so in this third podcast, we're going to touch on building, the construction, expropriation, train delays, getting it done before the end of spring. So, but I just want to touch on for a second, before we get into that, we had an election in October of 2014. And it was a pretty heated time period. I know you're not directly involved in elections, but obviously you're observing what's going on. And I'm just wondering from your chair, from your seat at the CAO desk, what was going through your mind? Because it was fairly heated. So you had the JISA lawsuit and some other things going on. What you were thinking during that period of time?
Yeah, I think that that was pretty unusual. So JISA was running for regional chair, and I think he brought an injunction. You'll understand the legalities of this. I think he brought an injunction against the region trying to stop the start of construction. And, I remember meeting with our lawyers, internal and external legal counsel, and, somebody said, well, the first thing we need to do, I guess we have a certain amount of time to respond to an injunction.
Right.
And, the lawyer said, well, you know what, the first thing we need to do is get an extension of that time to respond. And my reaction was, no way. We're going to respond quickly, and we're going to try to get a decision quickly on this injunction. And so we worked, kind of around the clock with the legal team to put together all the reasons why, we've done all the right things and, the project should proceed. Yeah. And I guess a judge heard that quickly and made a decision quite quickly, which was to dismiss the injunction. So, which was, good, and it let the project proceed, which, given all of the work that had gone into it at that point, that was, I thought that was for sure the right decision and let us, carry on with some momentum. It was interesting, as a senior administrator, watching that election play out, because as we said, there was a lot of momentum. We had gone through a huge public consultation process. Council had debated this over and over again, reconsidered it a couple times, made a decision to proceed. We'd gone through a procurement process. We had a deal with consortium that had penalties if it was canceled.
Yeah.
So I'm watching all of this, and we'd broken ground prior to the election. So I'm watching all this thinking, wow, I really, really hope that the councillors who are supportive of this project get reelected. And as an administrator, we have no role in
No, I know.
influencing the election. So we just watched with great interest. And I think, Rob, that every councillor who was running, who had supported the project, got reelected.
Yeah, and I know Ken talks about it as it was a difficult campaign for him because there's a lot of stuff being flung around, we'll say.
Yeah.
But yeah, and he came through it as well. So, and I think from the court perspective, they're a bit, they're not too keen on interfering with governmental decisions unless there's some significant, let's say, charter violation occurring or what have you. And especially with the region, the work that you had done prior to that point is clear to show that there's good sound principles and arguments and reasons as to why we took the course we took, and it'd be hard to change any of that. So congrats on,
and it wasn't. And it wasn't just the regional chair election. There were other candidates running for council who were opposed to the project. And as I said, what was encouraging to see was every councillor who had supported the project who was running got reelected. So then as a administration, it's big sigh of relief. It's okay. The council is back, and we're quote, a bad pun, on track.
Yes, back to work.
Back to work. Well, we had never paused because
another
the
bad
contract
pun.
signed, and it's like,
another bad pun. Full steam ahead, although it's not a steam engine.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So let's talk about road construction. We'll sort of pick these various topics and touch on that. And one of the things that kind of I didn't realize early on, but came to appreciate later, was that the amount of road construction not only benefit obviously the construction of the ION, but the city's really benefited Kitchener-Waterloo from a lot of this work that was going on. And I was wondering about the cost sharing arrangement for some of the underground infrastructure that was being either replaced or or moved or what have you.
Yeah, so the construction was hugely complicated. And again, what a lot of people don't realize is, in building a light rail transit system, which is going to run on the surface, the first thing that had to be done was all of the underground utilities, which were underneath where the train was going to run, had to be relocated, because you don't want to have a water main break underneath train tracks, for example. It's just not good planning. So that required a huge amount of work. We were going through old historic built up areas with old buried infrastructure.
Right.
Sometimes buried infrastructure is like 100 years old. So that was the first piece of work that had to be done, was relocating old water mains, old sewer mains, old storm sewers. And sometimes, the records weren't great about exactly what was buried and where they were. And as I say, a lot of the infrastructure, the buried infrastructure, was owned by the city of Waterloo, City of Kitchener, and other utility companies. There was fiber optic cable, Bell Cable, Rogers Cable. So we were interacting with, a lot of utility companies, hydro utilities, for example. So we did, it was actually kind of complicated arrangements with the cities about the cost sharing. And the basic idea was, look, if it's really, really old and it's going to have to be replaced anyway, the cities should bear the cost. If it's new and, recently replaced, and city had no intention of digging it up again, then the region should bear the cost. And if it's somewhere in the middle, then we should split the cost. Like, that was the basic principle.
Right. But give me a rough idea. Yeah. Give me a rough idea though on age of infrastructure. What's considered new? What's considered old? Well,
as I said, I think there were some water mains that were probably approaching 100 years old.
Yeah.
So that's really old, and time to be replaced. And then, newer would be probably in the last 10 to 20 years would be considered new. Like, these buried infrastructure has pretty long service life.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people appreciate that. That's why I wanted to ask about that age thing. They don't appreciate how long.
Yeah, 50 to 100 years would be, not uncommon. So new is, kind of 10 to 20. If it was, replaced within the last 10, 20 years, that's pretty new. And the region bore all those costs.
Yeah. So what was the
it was
cost?
The region's project.
So cost sharing then, the cities, if it was in that 100-year-old category, the cities would bear the cost for that 100%.
Yeah. So the cities would pay if it's old, and I can't remember what the cutoff was. I honestly can't. Maybe it was 50 years. I can't remember.
Sure.
But if it was beyond that threshold, the city would pay 100% of the cost. If it was newer, then again, I can't remember the threshold, but if it was newer than, say, I don't know, 20, 25 years, the region would pay 100%. And if it was in between, then it might have been a sliding scale, or it might have been 50-50.
So that's interesting. Then presumably then all that infra around the tracks will be good for a very long time, for decades.
Yes. So, people lose sight of that. So one of the side benefits of building this project is all of the underground infrastructure along the corridor is now brand new. Yeah. So, that's a huge benefit to the cities and to the residents.
Was it sized? Was it sized with the anticipation of the intensification that we've been seeing going on?
So I think there was some upgrading of pipe sizes that went on. Trying to look ahead and say, okay, well, let's make sure we replace it with something that's going to be serviceable for the next, number of decades. Not just blindly replace it with the same size pipes that were already there.
Yeah. So we'll talk about Corduroy Road in a moment, but I was just curious whether there was anything, because obviously, as you said, you're getting into this. Grand Link is getting into this. They don't know what's underneath necessarily the ground. So I guess the contracts with Grand Link would have had some accommodation for any surprises that might have come up during construction.
Yeah. So typically, in projects like this, you do the best you can based on, old historic records that exist, as well as some investigation that had gone on during the design phase. But then, you don't quite know what's going to be there until you, open up the ground and see what's under there. So there were some provisions in the contract for, if there's things that are really significantly different than what was anticipated, that's a legitimate claim for the contractor to say, look, this is materially different. But given the nature of this design build, they bore some of the risk and the region bore some of the risk.
Right.
And, we'll talk later about as construction proceeded, there were a number of things that Grand Link claimed were outside the scope that they anticipated.
Sure, that's always going to happen. I had that with my arena community center project too. Like, I think within 2 months of starting construction, we were getting delay letters from, I think that's a game plan, it looks like, but playbook. But anyway, was there anything, and we'll talk about like the bubble and the famous bubble and all that stuff, but was there anything found in Kitchener underneath that was a bit of a surprise at all?
No, we'll come back and talk about the Corduroy Road in a second.
That's
the biggest surprise. There were a couple of places, I think, in Kitchener, and I don't know if it was water mains or if it was other utilities. It might have been hydro vaults. Like, there's a lot of buried hydro infrastructure too, where things were encased in concrete. And, they're digging up and expecting to dig up a pipe or dig up a conduit for cable. And they came across these masses of concrete. And it sort of looked like, somebody had tried to fix something and they just, poured a whole bunch of concrete in the hole and let it harden. So, again, as a contractor, you start that, and, you expect to, be easy digging dirt with a backhoe. And next thing you know, you're into, sort of this massive concrete and having to chip it out with jackhammers. So, that happened a couple of times. And, those were, they slow things down. They slow production down a bit.
So no idea what that was all about.
I can't remember what exactly that one was.
Wasn't Al Capone's vault or anything like that?
I don't know. Yeah.
So, and in the contract itself, it would have had a section dealing with archaeological issues, correct?
Yes, and typically there's provision, and there's provincial regulations around how you deal with archaeological finds. So, typically, if you find something that's of archaeological significance, you got to pause work, get in, somebody to have a look at it, determine how significant it is, and then, take appropriate steps after that, which can be just photographically documenting something, or it can be, pausing work, carefully excavating it, preserving the artifacts. That's typically written into the contract, and it was written into this one.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so, along the lines of artifacts, I mean, was there anything, and we'll talk about the corduroy road, but were there any significant archaeological finds through the length of the ION?
Not that I recall. And, we'll come back to that corduroy road hopefully soon. No, because, I think a lot of this area had already been disturbed, right? Like, things had been dug up because basically we were digging up old water mains and sewers and storm sewers. So it's not like we're digging in, undisturbed ground where we might find, indigenous longhouse or indigenous burial ground or something like that. So,
well, along the lines of that, then, I mean, let's go to the corduroy road, because again, that's King Street in Uptown Waterloo, which one would have expected would have been dug up many times over. Yeah. And yet a corduroy road was found. First of all, was that expected?
No. No. After we dug it up, there were a couple people said, well, there's historical records about this road existing from, I think, maybe it was Abraham Erb's house to his mill, or I can't remember the details, but people say, oh yeah. If you go back through the history, there's records of this. Well, I don't think we had gone back that far when we were looking at the design.
Now, if I ask you, like, what is a corduroy road? Can you give us a rough definition of what that is? So what is that?
So imagine logs laid crossways. Like, typically they put them in like muddy, marshy areas, swampy areas. So you cut a bunch of logs, lay them crossways, and then that becomes the road. That becomes the driving surface. And over time, they sort of sink down kind of into the soft soil a little bit. And the reason they call it corduroy is, as the wheels go over it like bump, 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 over this. Right?
I think of corduroy pants, but I mean,
well, yeah. Imagine that, right? And so, so that's what was there, was old logs laid crossways, so going, across sort of the travel direction of the road. I think it was down below where the water main was, so they had to excavate, to the water main, go a little bit below, because I think they were maybe going a little bit deeper, and that's where they came across.
So it was a little deeper than had ever really been gone. Obviously, had ever been gone before.
I think so. Wow. Otherwise, it would have been dug up before. Yeah. So then they came across this. They paused, and did everything that I talked about a minute ago. Yeah. Had somebody come investigate it, determine what it was. I remember, and they paused work. This took like 4 to 6 weeks to sort it out.
Oh, and it was forever. It felt like,
and it became a bit of a, I guess not tourist attraction, but an object of curiosity. Because the
I went downtown. I went uptown.
Exactly. Yeah. The excavation was, there were fences, but you could see into the bottom of this excavation. You could actually see it. I remember going and walking and looking through the chain link fence, looking at it, going, well, that's kind of interesting.
I'm sure you were there pretty quick. What the heck's going on now?
So anyway, so then they determined what it was, but also that it needed to be removed. They documented it, photographically documented it, and then excavated it all. So all these pieces of wood, and then we're trying to figure out, well, what to do with this. And people were quite interested in it. So we took it to the Waterloo landfill site, cut the logs into, I'm going to say, bite-sized pieces, like sort of 1 foot pieces. Right. And then we did a giveaway. We said, 8 o'clock on, Friday morning, we're giving away pieces of the corduroy road. You can have your own piece of history. And, we thought people would trickle in. There were lineups on Herb Street. Like we had to get traffic control in.
Oh, geez.
So lined up, and in a couple hours, we'd given away a couple thousand pieces of corduroy road.
Yeah, I remember one
Yeah.
person, I think, was making like pens with the wood. So I don't know. Do you have a piece, Mike, of the corduroy road?
Well, I had a piece, and it looked like it sat in my garage for a little while, and it looks like old rotting wood is what it looks like. And although it's a piece of history, finally my wife said that piece of rotting wood has to go, and so we got rid of it. We got rid of it.
She wasn't going to let you become a hoarder.
No, so I no longer have that little piece of history. I got some other memories of the project, not that.
So that caused a bit of a delay then, I guess. Would costs have been incurred because of that, of a delay caused by the corduroy road finding?
Yeah, so things like that did add to the contractor's costs, right? Because they would have crews that were mobilized, who they would have to either kind of stand them down, put them on hold, or they have to move them to another location. So it did increase their costs. It also increased their costs. They had extra security and extra hoarding and fencing and investigation costs and removal costs they hadn't anticipated. So, that's the kind of thing that, these were legitimate extra costs.
So Uptown Waterloo is a bit of a boggy place, I guess, back in the day.
It apparently was. And there were a few other challenging spots in Uptown Waterloo that people who paid attention to the construction will remember.
Like Caroline. One was and
Urban Caroline, which is a complicated intersection. Anybody who's familiar with Uptown Waterloo knows it's a complicated intersection. There's traffic movement, pedestrian movement, cycling movements, a train, all going at different funny angles through that intersection. And that was one of the early places where the contractor started work. And there's a high groundwater table in that area. And so, they're excavating to try to do the underground utility work, but they were encountering groundwater, so they had to de-water. So that was a very challenging spot. It's
funny you mentioned that, because I just did a podcast with Melissa Durrell talking about her time as a counselor. So she would have been the counselor in Uptown Waterloo at that time. And she did reference a lot of the challenges as a counselor, not only Corduroy Road, but things that were happening over in that area as well. So from a working with small businesses perspective in Uptown Waterloo.
Yeah, and that just raises an interesting point about the whole construction. So I think it was really disruptive. We knew it was going to be disruptive. I'm not sure we appreciated quite how disruptive it was that it actually was. So anybody who recalls, King Street was torn up from sort of sidewalk face to sidewalk face or more, and we did a lot of work with the local businesses to maintain access to businesses. That was critical, and we were able to do that. It took a lot of work by regional staff, the contractor, Uptown, working with the BIAs, Uptown Waterloo and Downtown Kitchener BIAs, and the businesses who were affected. We had done some things about trying to get them prepared for construction, do some advertising, work with the BIAs on advertising and promotion, and messages like, Uptown's still open, patronize your favorite shops, help them through construction. And so I think most of the businesses, not all, but most of them realized, this is short-term pain. It's going to be long-term gain, because
hopefully,
the streetscape's going to be better. We're going to get more pedestrians. We're going to get more business. And I think that's what's materialized. But it was a pretty tough time.
I think for some areas where there's a station in that 800 meter or kilometer radius, usually it's 800 meter radius, there's definitely a benefit. There's some areas though where there seems to be a long stretch, like Ottawa Street in Kitchener, where it goes from Mill all the way down to Charles, and so that stretch really less beneficial. But talking about difficult areas, then let's go to the grade separation at King and Victoria, and that connects us to the bubble, right? So tell us about that situation.
So this was another area. So in general, one of the significant challenges with this whole construction was in some areas, we were either on existing rail corridors or crossing rail corridors.
Right.
And so any time we're interacting with the railway companies, CN and CP, project sitter, they're probably listening, but railway companies are very difficult to deal with.
They're the worst.
They are very, very challenging. And they've got, you know, some pretty significant rules about what has to happen. And, you know, a lot of it, I get, it's all safety related, you know, rail safety related, but they're very, very rigid.
Look, their attitude is we built the country and it's never changed from 18 whatever until today.
Yeah. We built the country and it's ours.
Exactly.
We were here, and their attitude, which is actually true, is we were here first.
Pretty well, I know it's totally wrong, but anyway, that's I know, because we dealt with them on train whistles going through town and trying to get that changed, and it's deaf ears. But tell us about Victoria.
So working with railways was really challenging in general. King and Victoria, anybody who recalls, there was a level crossing. The CN, I think it's CN tracks, crossed King Street at grade. And so one of the parts of this whole design was we had to have a grade separation. But while we were doing that, the rail corridor had to be maintained in continuous operation. So imagine that, you know, trying to keep a heavy rail corridor, there's freight, there's GO trains, I have to keep that in continuous operation at the same time as we're building basically King Street and the LRT tracks going under the existing rail tracks.
So you're maintaining the integrity of the tracks while you're taking away ground underneath the tracks.
Right. So it's just intensely and maintaining traffic on King Street.
Right.
So intensely challenging. There were delays in getting access to the rail corridor. There's also other utilities along the rail corridor. There's hydro and cable and fiber along the rail corridor. So not only did we have to deal with the rail companies, we had to deal with all these utility companies in getting access to their buried infrastructure. So there were delays in getting access to the rail corridor. There were delays in doing some of the soil investigations on the rail corridor because you couldn't do the soil investigations until you could get access. So this was really challenging for the region. It was really challenging for the contractor. I think it was very frustrating for the contractor because they didn't have any leverage over the rail companies. The rail companies goes, well, it's not our problem, it's your problem. You're the contractor, and it's the region's project.
So there would have been a timeline to do all this work, but because of these delays, it pushed it into periods of more inclement weather.
So they, you know, things were delayed, and then it got so that, you know, this, I don't know if it was on the critical path, the construction schedule critical path from the get-go. I think it probably was, but with the delays, for sure it was on the critical path. And then we got into fall of, I guess, 2016, and there was still a huge amount of work that had to be done, and there was a whole bunch of concrete that had to be poured, and it was getting into wintertime. And so then there's a lot of discussion about what are we going to do? Are we either going to just shut this whole thing down until spring or try to work through the winter? And if we're going to work through the winter, we need to do it in some sort of climate controlled way so we get decent construction quality and concrete quality. And so there was agreement that they were going to work through the winter, and they built a dome. It was like the sports world golf dome. And so that was very visible. It was a very large dome.
Got a lot of attraction.
So some construction issues aren't visible, and, you know, you resolve them, and, you know, people aren't really aware. This one was highly visible. Right?
Yeah, so highly visible are two words you don't like to hear as a municipal staff person, right? I mean,
well, exactly. I think, you know, nobody really wanted that visibility. Nevertheless, it was the right thing to do. It was the right way to do it. It did keep the project moving along, and it did give the contractor a decent working environment. And they did a lot of work through sort of January and February of that year, and basically got the grade separation built. And I think it opened in, I can't remember, the spring, I guess.
But there
Or
was only
summer.
one season of the dome, right? There wasn't,
Yeah,
there was
no,
only,
just
only
one.
one. And so it kept it going. So now the dome though wasn't contemplated in the original contract though, correct?
Correct,
So how
yes.
did that get dealt
Yeah.
with then?
Right, so, so you can imagine there was a lot of debate, discussion
Oh yeah,
between the region and the contractor about,
right,
whose cost was this to bear. And in the end, there was, actually a fairly significant claim from the contractor for a whole number of delay and extra scope issues. So the grade separation was probably the single biggest one, but things like the grade separation, corduroy road, we changed locations of some of the stops a little bit. There were other delays around property and getting them access to property. So in the end, they had a claim for many different, like, small things and large things like the dome. And in 2017, we came to an agreement with them that settled a whole bunch of construction related claims.
And
that
just
was
back to that for a second. Those letters that you get about delay claims, those I remember seeing those just on our project, and it's a bit stressful when you start getting those, because that's either leading to litigation or some resolution that's going to cost some money. And there's so many different parties involved though, because like you said, CN wasn't allowing access. So how does that factor into who's responsible for that and the delays that are caused by that? There's just so many parties and so many, the litigation on this just would have been horrific. Absolutely horrific.
And that's why sort of mid-project, and there was a public report in December of 2017 that was sort of a major project update on schedule, budget, claims. And, so that was like, I'm going to say it was mid-project, and Rob, so we settled out many of the claims that the contractor had made to that point.
Right.
Because we acknowledged, yeah, some of these are legit. Some of them we thought were inflated. But it was better at that point to come to some reasonable agreement on extra costs rather than just letting it fester on for
I think that's
another couple of years. And the meter's always running, but
based on my legal experience, I agree. If you can resolve some of these things early, get them off the table, because if it just rolls, that snowball just it's an avalanche by the time you get to the end of it.
And that was sort of our view, is there were some things that were easier to resolve, and that's what we did mid-project. And then the contractor reserved the right to further claims, which they always do.
I want to ask this. When you look at some, along with construction, I want to talk about bike lanes, for example, and that sort of thing. And, some areas, like you look at Charles Street, and it just seems like a really tight area to be operating in. What was the contemplation about bike lanes and all of that, multi-use trails? I'm sure that was thought about, but there might have been some practicalities that came into play. What can you say about that?
Yeah, it's a really, really good point. So some of the areas where the LRT is running, there's really narrow rights of way. Charles Street is one, and there's other parts of King Street where it's really quite narrow. And Rob, that's also the reason why in some areas, like the really narrow right of way areas, the route splits and it goes one direction down one street and one direction on another street. Is
like because in Kitchener.
In Kitchener and in Uptown Waterloo. Right. This part that goes down Caroline. And Caroline and King are running in parallel.
And Ottawa Street too goes one way.
So in a couple of places, like there's just not enough real estate, there's not enough space to build the LRT and a traffic lane for cars and a proper bike lane. Like there's just not enough. So what we tried to do in places like that was make sure that, one or two blocks either side of the LRT, there was good cycling infrastructure. So, maybe you can't bike right down this street, but if you go one block to the east or west or north or south, you've got a good bike lane. And, that I think is probably the best we could do in the circumstances. It's not ideal. And you know, I'm a cyclist. And so there's a few places where, you know, I'd be pretty reluctant to bike. You know, then I just jog over a block, or in a couple of those areas, there's really good off-road cycling. The Iron Horse Trail goes, you know, kind of through Uptown. And,
right.
So there's, I think, significantly improved off-road cycling infrastructure, like in the last, you know, 5 to 8 years.
Yeah, I would say there's been a greater commitment from local government to doing something along those lines. So what about then along that line too, emergency vehicles in some areas? Like I'm thinking about if I'm on Charles Street, for example, and an ambulance or fire truck is coming up behind me, I guess I've got to pull into a driveway or something to get out of the way.
Yeah. So emergency vehicles was a significant consideration through the design phase and construction phase. And the region and Grand Link worked pretty closely with police, fire, and EMS to make sure that they had decent access and that they could operate. And so I'll give you an example with EMS. The dispatchers know some of those areas where it's really tight. And so they won't route ambulances down those streets. Like if the ambulance is responding to a call right there, of course the ambulance goes there, but otherwise the ambulances avoid some of those areas for exactly the reasons that you say. So police, fire, and EMS dispatchers understand the geography and I think try to route the vehicles accordingly. And my recollection is there was an agreement that in really significant emergency situations, the emergency vehicles could drive along the tracks. We call it the rapid way.
Okay.
And so they could drive along the tracks, and it would be only for a very, very short distance, right? Like if they needed to, you know, bypass an accident or something like that. The curbs, like about 3 inches high.
Right.
And so all the emergency vehicles can mount a curb that's that high. So it doesn't happen very often. And the, you know, not worse, but you know, the other, you know, fallback is say there was a fire right in a building right adjacent to the LRT. Right. They would just stop the LRT, right? And
yes.
So they would have it short turn at the station before and the station after, and then they'd have what we call a bus bridge where in between. And you know, that happens for traffic collisions, it happens for periodic maintenance, it would happen in the event of an emergency.
I'll tell you a quick story. I had a client actually who got hit by a truck that was going down Charles. So this pickup truck was trying to get someplace, and the GPS, I guess, hadn't gotten up to speed yet on the new infrastructure. And what would have been a left turn onto a road along Charles, now suddenly there were the curbs from the ION which blocked that road. And the person, not being fully aware of the surroundings, blindly, so to speak, turned left and turned left, mounted the curb, ended up hitting my client who's coming the other way on Charles Street in a front on front collision. So yeah, I mean, that's those things, I guess. Unfortunately, there were a lot of accidents. Well, not a lot, but there were some heightened at the beginning, but now was like with roundabouts, as we're getting used to the ION in our midst, we're getting more aware and being more cautious in certain areas.
Yeah, people are getting better.
Yeah, they are.
There was a bit of a learning curve.
Yes. So just on that, then you were talking about the amount of roadway that you had. I mean, in order to get the amount of land you needed, there's this thing called the expropriation, which I don't think any municipality likes to do. And it always scares people when they hear that the local government's going to expropriate some of their land. But the Expropriation Act and the process was a pretty significant part of this project as well, in terms of maybe not lots, not huge amounts of land or large amounts of land taken from one individual, although there may have been one or two of those, but a lot of small pieces or slivers taken from a lot of people.
Yeah. So I think, we were in I'm going to say 100 to 200 pieces of property that we needed. And, they could range from, a foot off the front of somebody's property to whole takings, like of a whole lot that had a building on it and maybe had a business on it.
Right.
And so the region's approach always, and we get into this on road construction projects all the time and other infrastructure projects. The region's approach always has been to try to negotiate an agreement between the property owner and the region. And in, I would say, most cases, that's successful, because the region knows we're going to pay. We're going to pay. At the very least, we're going to pay fair market value. And probably if we go right through the whole expropriation process, we're actually going to pay more, because we're going to pay fair market value. We're going to pay their costs,
legal costs. Yeah.
We're going to, it's going to cost us. So the region knows that. We've done it a lot.
Yeah.
So, I think most of the properties were acquired voluntarily, like negotiated agreements.
Yeah. Negotiations.
Negotiations. Then there were some, I don't know how many, where we would have followed the expropriation process right through. And then, the law sets out the compensation that property owners are entitled to and the process that they're entitled to go through, which ultimately ends up at, it used to be called the OMB. Now it's, I think, Ontario Land Tribunal.
Yeah.
And so there were, probably a handful, maybe two handfuls of properties that ended up in significant dispute between the region and the property owner. I think some of those are actually still making their way through the legal system.
I think there's one recently, grocery store in Midtown.
And so, again, and so partly on businesses that were affected, where we were taking property from businesses, there were two impacts on the business. One is the property itself, and then the other was the impact on their business of the construction. And it's called injurious affection. And I would say in most cases, the business was more concerned with the injurious affection than just the value of the property that we were taking.
Right. The interruption in their business going forward. During that period of time.
And then, you get differences of opinion about, how much was their business interrupted? How much was it due to the construction?
Right.
Sometimes they have good records, sometimes they don't. So like I said, some of those are still, I think, winding their way through the legal process. And, there's a process, and there's no,
it's true. It's true. I deal with a lot of small business owners who might get hurt in an accident, and now you're trying to assess, okay, what were you earning before? What are you earning now? A lot of times with small businesses, I mean, they're type A driven individuals, and they find a way to keep the business going. And sometimes the loss isn't as great as one might think. But again, the records aren't always good because they're busy plying their craft, and then to have to do all that paperwork after is a whole nother thing. So like I said earlier when we were talking about Uptown Waterloo, and the same was very, very true in downtown Kitchener. The region tried to work really closely with the affected businesses and with the BIAs to try to minimize the impact of construction, try to mitigate it, help them with advertising and promotion and all kinds of things like that. So, I think the region tried to do as much as they could. We really wanted businesses to, maintain themselves through the construction and thrive going forward. Like, that's the whole goal, is to try to, have a thriving small business sector. Yeah, I know. And then, it gets up and running and for businesses, especially Waterloo with the corduroy road delay too, it would seem to be extra long and difficult with that fencing around and just very hard to get around. And then, pandemic hits us in March of 2020, which is like shortly after, like a year later. So it's, but anyway, it's tough. So, and I think a lot of people don't realize with expropriation, it's not only the issue of the land taking, but it's also the issue of loss of business or the impact on business as well that has to be compensated. And I think it's from my experience, again, with personal injury matters, I mean, the courts can deal with stuff, but they can only deal with so much stuff. And if you're talking about long court delays, if you don't get to the point of reasonably settling claims through negotiation or mediation, that's really the route that you have to consider. Now, trains were a big part of all this too. And I don't know if it's like best laid plans of mice and men. It was a good idea at the start, but I think it was still a good idea, but there was just some execution on the part of the manufacturer that was a big problem. But so why don't we talk about that?
Yeah. So let's talk about the trains. So, in the grand scheme of light rail systems around the world, ours, the regions, is relatively small. And so we had 14 vehicles. So early in the planning of this, we go, wow, that's a relatively small vehicle order. And so, you know, if we went to the market with a tender or an RFP, you know, we weren't quite sure what sort of response we would get from vehicle suppliers and manufacturers. They might either really high prices because it's such a small order, or they might just ignore it. It's like, no, this isn't worth our while. So we're looking at that. And at the same time, Metrolinx, provincial agency, had an order with Bombardier for like, I'm going to say 100+ vehicles for light rail transit systems that Metrolinx was building in the Greater Toronto area.
Yeah, I just want to jump in for a second. Just tell people who Metrolinx is.
Yeah, so Metrolinx is a provincial agency of the Ontario provincial government that basically is responsible for building and operating transit systems mostly in the Greater Golden Horseshoe. So, for instance, Metrolinx operates Go Transit. So they're basically Go Transit. They are also building Eglinton Crosstown LRT in Toronto, Finch West LRT in Toronto, the Mississauga Hazel McCallion LRT in Mississauga. They're building an LRT in Hamilton. So that gives you a sense of the scope of their capital program is in many billions of dollars. And really we're in a generational transformation of higher order transit in the Greater Golden Horseshoe area.
And then the province controls it through Metrolinx.
Yeah, so they're an arm of the provincial government. Their funding comes from the provincial government, but they're just a tiny bit at arm's length. They basically report through the Minister of Transportation.
Right. Okay, so now we're tagging on to their
so
order,
Metrolinx.
basically.
So Metrolinx has an order with Bombardier for, I'm going to say, 100. Pick a number. It's a lot of light rail vehicles, initially for their Eglinton Crosstown LRT project. So, and they had a clause in their agreement with Bombardier that allowed them to increase the order. And so we talked to Metrolinx about taking advantage of that option in their contract with Bombardier. And so then the region, negotiated an agreement with Bombardier to basically, we call it piggyback on the Metrolinx agreement. So basically, 95% of the terms and conditions in the contract were identical to Metrolinx's. And so basically we had this piggyback agreement for 14 vehicles. I think the cost was about $95 million for the vehicles, which is $6.5 to $7 million per vehicle, which in the grand scheme of things, pretty good. And we entered into this agreement with Bombardier in July of 2013. And at that time, the agreement with them was all the vehicles were to be delivered by December of 2016.
Okay.
And the system was supposed to start in the fall of 2017. Okay, so think about that. So there we are, July of 2013.
Yeah.
We go, okay, that's 3.5 years to get 14 vehicles. And they were supposed to come from the middle of the production run. Right. So they'd have all the bugs worked out, and they'd be in total, efficient, effective production mode. We'd be getting 14 vehicles from the middle of this production run, be fabulous. Well, it didn't quite work out that way, as everybody knows.
Right.
So shortly after, we started getting some concerns that they weren't hitting their interim targets for vehicle assembly. And then I think it was, so I'm just pausing now. Anyway, so the first vehicle was supposed to be delivered in August of 2016. So late 2015, it's very obvious to us, this is not going to happen.
Had they been delivering to Metrolinx? Because we're in the middle of the pack.
No. So they had not produced a single vehicle at this point.
And these are being built. Why don't you tell us where they're being built?
Yeah. So they were being assembled. I'm going to say assembled in Bombardier's facility in Thunder Bay.
Yes.
But this was a lesson for us in two things. One is global supply chains, and the second is manufacturing quality control. So they were getting sub-assemblies built in different parts of the world. They had a facility in Mexico that was building, I think, the frames, like the undercarriage, the steel frames. They had another facility in Quebec that was doing something else. And then all these sub-assemblies were getting shipped from these different areas to Thunder Bay for final assembly. This was the theory. This is how global supply chains work. But in doing that, you have to have really good quality control every step of the way, because what was happening is the bits and pieces that they were getting from these different facilities wouldn't fit together. And so then they were having to do rework, they're having to send things back.
I just want to ask you, Mike, just before we get into that, weren't these trains used in Europe previously?
Yes. So this is the Bombardier Flexity vehicle. It's been manufactured and they've had these in operation in Europe for quite some time. And so the train design is proven train design.
Right.
They had not assembled these vehicles in North America before. They had built them, assembled them in Europe before. And so, you'd think that they'd be able to, transport some of their knowledge and their
There's a template. There's a template here.
You would think there was. There wasn't. And the other thing is Metrolinx's Eglinton Crosstown project was also a bit delayed. So Metrolinx wasn't putting too much pressure on Bombardier because their track work was delayed. So they early on, they weren't super concerned about the schedule slippage. We then became quite concerned because it's obvious that they weren't going to produce Metrolinx's vehicles on time. And then it became obvious they weren't going to produce our vehicles on time.
And we're just the tail on this dog, so to speak, right?
So, and this is now public, but so the contract with Bombardier had penalties for late delivery of vehicles. The penalties were $1,500 per day per vehicle for any day that they were late. Okay, so you do the math there. Well, that's pretty significant.
Yeah.
The problem was the total amount of penalties was capped at about 5% of the contract value. So total contract value about $90 million. 5% of that is about $4.5 million.
And for a company like Bombardier, what is that, right?
It's pocket change. It's pocket change. And, very quickly, they reached that cap, right? They knew it. They had reached that cap. And so financially, in terms of penalties, there's no more leverage or motivation.
No incentive or leverage, right?
No incentive to get them to actually perform.
So how did you resolve? Yeah, how did you resolve this then? I mean, there was a change then in the delivery order, right?
Yeah. So there were a couple of things that happened. One is we just, you just try to keep putting pressure on and lawyers' letters and when we said, their delays in getting the trains to us were causing our delays in getting the system tested and operational, and we're also contributing to delay claims from GrandLink.
So Mike, I just want to say quickly, everyone makes fun of us until they actually need us.
Yeah, exactly. The lawyers' letters. So you think, well, what did we do? So lawyers' letters, we just ramped up the pressure on them, and we visited their facility. I think we visited Mexico. We visited Thunder Bay. So we're on the ground. We're saying, we actually don't believe you guys anymore.
Yeah.
So we want to go and see with our own eyes, us and our consultants, see with our own eyes what the status of work on our vehicles is in Mexico, in Thunder Bay. And then they opened up a new production facility in Kingston. And that was one of the keys, because that was purpose built to assemble these vehicles. Their Thunder Bay facility was like 100-year-old heavy rail assembly plant, dirty, bad lighting, dirty,
corduroy roads,
old, kind of turn of the century industrial manufacturing. Not state-of-the-art, light rail vehicle manufacturing. The Kingston facility was purpose-built to assemble these vehicles.
So you were able to get your order bumped up. Was that one of the things?
Yes. Yes. And so that was an agreement between Bombardier, Metrolinx, and the region. And Metrolinx was becoming increasingly concerned about their vehicles. And so they renegotiated some things. This is in the public realm. They renegotiated a deal with Bombardier that did a couple of things. It reduced the size of their order. It changed the timing of their order, and it changed the financial penalties.
And the other thing I just want to jump on quickly is like these trains, there's special signaling and software and other things that have to be done for our particular purpose. If you just quickly touch on that.
I'll come to that in a second. So there were probably three things that finally broke the logjam with Bombardier: getting the Kingston facility up and running, Metrolinx negotiating a new deal with Bombardier that also included increased penalties for Bombardier not delivering our vehicles.
Oh, okay.
So Metrolinx was flexing their muscles, and it helped us.
Nice.
And then they had a change in some of their senior and middle management people. They brought in a new chief operating officer who was highly effective.
At Bombardier, you mean?
Bombardier.
Yeah.
Bombardier.
Okay.
Yeah. So those three things probably kind of got things somewhat back on track. But the original plan was that all the vehicles were supposed to be delivered by December of 2016. We got our first vehicle, I think, in February of 2017, and it was, I'm going to say it was a shell. It was largely non-functional.
Well, I think you said that when you started with the show, you're going to say like poop show, but anyway.
It was, you know what? It was good to have it in a way because it let us do a little bit of testing, but it still needed a ton of work. But then the vehicles started trickling in. We finally got all the vehicles by December of 2018. So basically 2 years wow. Late.
Yeah.
But then, so then Rob, to your point, the vehicles are sort of generic. And then every LRT system is slightly different, has different signaling systems, different communication between the vehicles and the track and the traffic signals. And communication system, how the drivers talk to the control center. So that equipment then needed to be retrofitted on the trains. Now, ideally, it all gets done while the trains are being built, but because of all the delays, that didn't happen. And so then as the trains were arriving in Waterloo, there was this whole extra step of getting the special equipment retrofitted onto the trains. And there was also a dispute about who was going to do that, whether GrandLink was going to do that or whether Bombardier was going to do that.
Okay.
And in fact, there was dispute about in whose contract was that included.
There's always some detail, right? I mean, you try to include a lot, but there's always something that happens.
So, so that, again, there was just an other little wrinkle, little bump in the road that we had to get over just when we thought, oh, things are going better. We're starting to get vehicles delivered. Then it's like, well, okay, now we got this other issue with the special equipment and who's going to install it and how do we get it all installed and tested. But we got that resolved. And I think in the end, Bombardier ended up doing that. And we ended up paying a little bit extra to get it done and get it done quickly.
Yeah.
But by then it was worth it. So I think in around late 2018, as the vehicles were, we were pretty confident we got all the vehicles. Then we said, we're going to have the system in operation in the spring of 2019.
Right.
And that became the mantra. So we still had a lot of work in terms of tests, like installing the special equipment, testing all the vehicles. There's reams of tests that have to get done to make sure the system is safe for moving passengers. The very first test, I think, was they test the envelope of the tracks. They actually tow a vehicle. It's going like walking speed down a whole corridor, right? Because they have to test to make sure that, that nothing's encroaching on this envelope that the vehicle is going to travel.
Train comes off the track because of some impediment.
Both height and width. So that just gives you, that's, I think that was the very first test, was towing a vehicle the whole length up and down and making sure that physically it would work.
Yeah, the ultimate test was June 21st, 2019, and we're going to have to end it there. We've reached the end of the track on this discussion. But,
Yeah.
Mike, I just want to thank you for all your work, because when we read about what's going on in Ottawa and stuff, we can be pretty happy here in Waterloo Region, and really, blessed that the team got it done. Even though there was a delay, it's done well, and we've got a functioning, well operating system here. So thanks for all of that, and thanks for sharing your memories and your time through the 3 episodes. I really appreciate it, Mike.
Yeah, and you know what, Rob, it was totally a team effort. The Grand Link team, Bombardier team, and the region had an amazing team of people. The region and our technical consultants, technical, legal, financial advisors. Yeah. Projects like this, take a whole village, they take a whole team, and regional council was solid the whole way. So yeah, it's not just me. I was fortunate to, kind of lead an awesome team of people, and I think it's proving its worth.
Thank you for listening to another edition of the Old Grey Mares podcast. If you have any ideas for stories or people you would like us to interview or reach out to, please feel free to contact us. And thank you again.